The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellis Air Force Base as 80-year-old Emma Rodriguez clutched her carefully folded paper airplane, her small fingers trembling with excitement and nerves. The annual Bring Your Child to Work Day had transformed the usually serious military installation into a playground of discovery, where children explored everything from flight simulators to aircraft maintenance bays. But for Emma, this day meant something far more personal than just a fun outing with her father. Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern as she studied. The real fighter jets lined up on the tarmac. Emma had been obsessed with aviation since she could walk, spending countless hours watching planes take off from their base housing, building elaborate paper aircraft, and asking questions that sometimes stumped even experienced pilots. Her bedroom walls were covered with pictures of famous aviators, technical diagrams she'd drawn from memory, and a collection of model planes that represented every era of military aviation. "Dad, can I show Captain Williams my new design?" Emma asked, holding up her paper creation with the same reverence other children might reserve for a treasured toy. The airplane was unlike any typical paper plane, featuring complex folds, adjustable flaps, and what appeared to be carefully calculated proportions that suggested serious thought had gone into its construction. Miguel smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. Captain Sarah Williams had been mentoring Emma informally for months, recognizing something special in the girl's natural understanding of aerodynamics and flight principles. Williams herself had broken barriers as one of the few female fighter pilots on base, and she saw in Emma the same spark that had driven her own career. "Of course, Mia, Captain Williams is over by the flight line with the other demonstration crew," Miguel said, pointing toward a group of pilots in flight suits who were explaining aircraft systems to fascinated children and their parents. As they walked across the tarmac, Emma's paper plane caught the attention of other children, who gathered around to admire its unusual design. Unlike the simple dart-shaped planes most kids made, Emma's creation featured swept-back wings, near the nose, and intricate fold patterns that seemed to mimic the geometry of modern fighter aircraft. "How did you make it look so real?" asked Tommy, a 10-year-old whose father worked in aircraft maintenance. "I studied the F-22 Raptor's wing configuration," Emma explained matter-of-factly, adjusting one of the small flaps with the precision of an engineer. "The angle of attack needs to be optimized for both stability and maneuverability. See these little folds here? They create vortices that improve lift distribution across the wing surface." The children stared at her with a mixture of admiration and confusion. Most 80-year-olds didn't casually discuss vortex generation and wing loading characteristics. But Emma spoke about aerodynamics the way other kids talked about their favorite cartoon characters. Their conversation was interrupted by a commanding voice that carried the unmistakable authority of senior military rank. "What exactly is going on here? This is a restricted area, not a playground." Major Bradley Hawkins strode toward the group with the bearing of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. At 45, he was a decorated pilot with over 20 years of service, multiple combat deployments, and a reputation for excellence that was matched only by his legendary arrogance. Hawkins believed deeply in military tradition, proper procedures, and the natural order that placed experienced officers at the top of every hierarchy. The children instinctively stepped back, intimidated by the major's stern demeanor and the array of ribbons and insignia that decorated his uniform. Even the adults in the group seemed to straighten their posture automatically, responding to decades of ingrained military protocol. "It's Bring Your Child to Work Day, sir," Miguel said respectfully, though his voice carried a note of protective concern for his daughter. "The children are just learning about aviation." Hawkins surveyed the group with the critical eye of someone inspecting troops for parade readiness. His gaze lingered on Emma, who stood her ground despite his intimidating presence, still clutching her paper airplane with quiet determination. "Learning about aviation," Hawkins repeated, his tone suggesting skepticism about what children could possibly understand about such a complex subject. "And what exactly are you learning, young lady?" Emma looked up at the major with the direct gaze that had always made adults take notice of her unusual maturity. "I'm learning about how wing geometry affects flight characteristics, sir, and how different fold patterns can simulate the aerodynamic properties of real aircraft." Hawkins' eyebrows rose slightly at her vocabulary, but his expression remained dismissive. "Is that so? And where exactly did you acquire this expertise in aerodynamics?" "From books, sir, and by watching the pilots practice, and by testing different designs to see which ones fly better." Emma held up her paper plane with obvious pride. "This one is based on the F-22's configuration, but I modified the control surfaces to improve stability at low speeds." A few adults in the group exchanged glances, recognizing that the child was demonstrating knowledge that went far beyond typical elementary school understanding. But Hawkins seemed more annoyed than impressed by her precocious display of technical knowledge. "Isn't that fascinating?" he said, with barely concealed sarcasm. "A paper airplane engineer. I suppose next you'll be telling me that folded paper can teach us something about real military aviation." Emma's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her composure with the dignity of someone who had faced skepticism before. "Paper planes follow the same aerodynamic principles as real planes, sir. The materials are different, but the physics are the same. Lift, drag, thrust, and weight, they all apply whether you're flying paper or metal." Hawkins let out a short laugh that carried no warmth or humor. "Physics are the same, are they? Child, I've been flying real aircraft for longer than you've been alive. I've completed missions in conditions that would terrify experienced pilots, and I've earned the right to speak about aviation with authority. A little girl playing with paper toys doesn't understand the first thing about what it takes to be a real pilot." The crowd around them had grown as other families stopped to watch the interaction. Miguel stepped closer to his daughter, his protective instincts warring with military protocol that discouraged challenging superior officers, especially in public settings. "Sir, with respect," Miguel began carefully, "Emma has been studying aviation very seriously. Captain Williams has been working with her on basic principles." "Captain Williams," Hawkins said dismissively, "is no doubt being kind to a child with an active imagination. But kindness shouldn't be confused with genuine competence. Real aviation requires years of training, physical conditioning, mental discipline, and the kind of experience that can't be gained from picture books and paper folding." Emma's small hands tightened around her airplane, but she refused to back down in the face of the Major's contempt. "Sir, would you like to see how my plane flies? Maybe then you could tell me what I'm doing wrong with the aerodynamics." Hawkins looked down at her with the expression of an adult barely tolerating a persistent child. "Oh, by all means, let's see this masterpiece of paper engineering in action. I'm sure we'll all learn something valuable about flight dynamics from your ... creation." The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut, and several adults shifted uncomfortably at his treatment of the child. But Emma seemed undaunted by his mockery, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who believed completely in her abilities. "Where would you like me to demonstrate, sir?" she asked politely. Hawkins gestured toward an open area of the tarmac with theatrical flourish. "Right here will be fine. We have plenty of room for your paper airplane to perform its aerodynamic wonders." Emma walked to the designated spot and carefully examined the wind conditions, holding up her hand to test air movement and studying the flags that hung from nearby buildings. Her methodical approach suggested she was taking the demonstration as seriously as a real pilot preparing for takeoff. "The wind is coming from the southeast at approximately 8 to 10 knots, she announced, positioning herself to account for the breeze. "I'll adjust the launch angle to compensate for the crosswind component." Hawkins rolled his eyes at her technical commentary, but several of the actual pilots in the crowd were beginning to pay closer attention to the girl's systematic approach. Captain Williams had appeared at the edge of the group, drawn by reports of the confrontation, and her expression grew concerned as she observed the Major's dismissive treatment of her young protege. Emma held her paper plane with both hands, studying its configuration one final time before launch. The airplane represented hours of careful design and testing, incorporating lessons learned from dozens of previous prototypes. She had optimized every fold, calculated every angle, and refined the control surfaces through systematic experimentation that would have impressed professional engineers. "Ready when you are, little pilot," Hawkins said with exaggerated patience. "Show us how your paper airplane is going to revolutionize military aviation." Emma drew her arm back and released the plane with a smooth, practiced motion that demonstrated she had performed this action hundreds of times before. The paper aircraft leaped from her hands and immediately began demonstrating flight characteristics that defied every expectation the crowd had formed about children's toys. Instead of the wobbly, unpredictable flight path typical of paper airplanes, Emma's creation flew with the stability and grace of a precision instrument. It climbed steadily, banked smoothly to compensate for wind conditions, and maintained perfect trim throughout its flight. The plane executed what appeared to be a controlled turn, adjusted its attitude for changing wind conditions, and finally touched down gently more than 50 yards away with the precision of a skilled pilot making a perfect landing. The crowd fell silent, stunned by the obvious sophistication of what they had just witnessed. Even Hawkins seemed momentarily speechless, his confident smirk replaced by an expression of surprise that he quickly tried to conceal. "That was adequate," he said finally, though his voice lacked the conviction of his earlier "For a paper toy, I suppose it performed reasonably well." But Emma wasn't finished. She walked to where her plane had landed, retrieved it carefully, and returned to the group with the measured pace of someone who had more to demonstrate. "Sir, would you like to see the aerobatic sequence?" she asked with quiet confidence. "This design can perform several advanced maneuvers if launched with the correct technique." Before Hawkins could respond, Captain Williams stepped forward from the crowd, her expression mixing pride in her young student with barely concealed irritation at the Major's behavior. "Major Hawkins," she said, with a respectful but firm tone. That suggested she had something important to add to the conversation. "I think you should know that Emma has been studying with me for several months. Her understanding of flight principles is genuinely impressive, and her paper aircraft designs demonstrate real engineering insight." Hawkins turned to face Williams with the expression of someone who didn't appreciate being contradicted in front of a crowd. "Captain, I appreciate your enthusiasm for mentoring children. But let's not confuse encouragement with reality. This is still just a little girl playing with paper." Williams' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, with respect, I think Emma's work speaks for itself. Perhaps we should let her continue the demonstration before making final judgments." The tension between the two officers was palpable, creating an atmosphere that made the assembled families increasingly uncomfortable. Miguel stepped closer to his daughter, ready to intervene if the situation escalated further, while Emma stood quietly between the competing adults, still holding her paper airplane and waiting for permission to continue. "Very well," Hawkins said finally, his voice carrying the tone of someone granting an indulgence he didn't believe was deserved. "Let's see these aerobatic wonders. I'm sure we'll all be educated by the experience." Emma nodded solemnly and returned to her launch position, but this time her preparation was even more deliberate. She adjusted the plane's control surfaces with tiny movements, tested the balance point by holding it at different locations, and studied the wind conditions with the intensity of a meteorologist preparing a forecast. This sequence will demonstrate barrel rolls, a loop, and a controlled stall recovery, she announced, as if she were briefing a flight plan to air traffic control. "The key is maintaining proper energy management throughout the maneuvers." She launched the plane with a different technique this time, giving it more initial velocity and a steeper climb angle. What happened next left even the experienced pilots in the crowd speechless with amazement. The paper airplane performed a perfect barrel roll, rotating smoothly around its longitudinal axis while maintaining forward momentum. It then executed a graceful loop, climbing vertically before transitioning into an inverted position and diving back toward the ground in a perfect circle. Finally, it demonstrated a controlled stall, nose-up attitude bleeding off airspeed until it hung motionless in the air for a moment before dropping into a nose-down recovery and resuming normal flight. The entire sequence lasted less than 30 seconds, but it represented a display of aerodynamic sophistication that no one in the crowd had ever seen from a paper aeroplane. The aircraft finally landed gently at Emma's feet, as if it had been programmed to return to its starting point. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of jets taking off from the active runway. Adults stared at the little girl who had just demonstrated flight characteristics that seemed impossible for a folded piece of paper to achieve. Even the children, who had been chattering excitedly throughout the demonstration, stood in stunned quiet. Major Hawkins opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, clearly struggling to process what he had just witnessed. His confident superiority had been replaced by confusion and something that might have been grudging respect, though his pride prevented him from acknowledging it openly. "Well," he said finally, his voice lacking its earlier conviction, "that was, certainly interesting. For a paper aeroplane." But Emma wasn't finished yet. She looked up at the Major with the same direct gaze that had characterized their entire interaction. And when she spoke, her words carried a quiet authority that seemed far beyond her 8 years. "Sir, would you like me to explain the engineering principles that make those maneuvers possible? Or would you prefer to see the plane that can perform combat-style evasive patterns?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Major Bradley Hawkins found himself without a ready response. The little girl with the paper airplane had just demonstrated capabilities that defied his understanding of what was possible. And now she was offering to teach him something about aviation. As the crowd waited for his answer, Emma stood quietly, confident, surrounded by the evidence of her remarkable abilities, ready to prove that sometimes the most important lessons about flying came from the most unexpected teachers. The tension on the tarmac was thick enough to cut with a knife as Major Hawkins stared down at Emma Rodriguez, his mind racing to process what he had just witnessed. The 8-year-old girl stood before him with quiet confidence, her paper airplane resting in her small hands like a precision instrument rather than a child's toy. Around them, the crowd of families, pilots, and base personnel waited in stunned silence for his response to her offer to demonstrate even more advanced capabilities. "Combat-style evasive patterns," Hawkins repeated slowly, his voice betraying the first crack in his armor of absolute certainty. From a paper airplane, Emma nodded with the matter-of-fact seriousness that had characterized her entire approach to aviation. "Yes, sir. I've been studying defensive maneuvering techniques used by fighter pilots in combat situations. The same principles that apply to full-size aircraft can be scaled down and adapted for paper plane demonstrations." Captain Williams stepped closer, her professional curiosity overriding her concern about the Major's earlier dismissive behavior. "Emma, are you talking about the exercises we discussed last month? The ones based on Top Gun training scenarios?" "Yes, ma'am. But I've made some modifications to account for the different flight characteristics of paper aircraft." Emma held up her plane, pointing to subtle design features that hadn't been apparent during her previous demonstrations. "These small canards can be adjusted to change the center of pressure, and these microtabs on the trailing edge function like rudder controls." Major Hawkins found himself leaning forward despite his skepticism, drawn by the technical precision of the girl's explanations. His 20 years of flying experience told him that what she was describing shouldn't be possible with folded paper, but the evidence of his own eyes suggested otherwise. "All right," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of challenge and genuine curiosity, "show me these combat maneuvers. But I want you to understand that real combat flying involves life-and-death decisions, split-second timing, and years of training that can't be replicated with paper toys." Emma's expression remained respectful but determined. "I understand that, sir, but the basic physics of evasive maneuvering are the same whether you're flying an F-16 or a paper plane. It's all about energy management, angular velocity, and exploiting your aircraft's performance envelope." The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread throughout the base about the unusual confrontation taking place on the flight line. Off-duty pilots, maintenance crews, and even some of the base's senior officers had gathered to witness the spectacle of an 8-year-old girl challenging one of their most decorated pilots. Among the newcomers was Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander whose reputation for fairness and tactical brilliance had earned her respect throughout the Air Force. She stood at the edge of the crowd, observing the situation with the analytical mind that had made her one of the youngest colonels in service. Emma walked to her launch position with the measured pace of a pilot conducting a pre-flight inspection. She held her airplane up to the light, checking the symmetry of the wings and making minute adjustments to the control surfaces. Her methodical approach suggested she understood that this demonstration would be watched and judged by some of the most experienced aviators in the military. This scenario simulates an engagement where the defending aircraft needs to break radar lock and avoid incoming missiles. Emma announced, her young voice carrying clearly across the tarmac. The key is to change direction unpredictably while maintaining enough energy to continue evasive action. She launched the plane with a sharp upward trajectory that immediately put it into a steep climb. What followed was a display of aerodynamic artistry that left even the most experienced pilots struggling to understand what they were seeing. The paper airplane performed a series of maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It executed sharp direction changes that would have torn apart a real aircraft, maintained controlled flight through impossible angles of attack, and demonstrated energy management techniques that rivaled those taught at the Air Force's most elite training programs. The plane performed what appeared to be a splitters maneuver, diving inverted before rolling upright and climbing again. It then executed a series of barrel rolls that transitioned seamlessly into a vertical climb, followed by a controlled stall that turned into a dramatic nose-down recovery. Finally, it performed what could only be described as a cobra maneuver, pulling its nose up to an extreme angle before settling back into normal flight. The entire sequence lasted 45 seconds and covered an area of airspace that demonstrated both tactical awareness and technical precision. When the plane finally landed gently near Emma's feet, the silence on the tarmac was absolute. Major Hawkins stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as his understanding of what was possible shifted fundamentally. The demonstration he had just witnessed incorporated maneuvers that were taught only at the most advanced levels of fighter pilot training, executed with a precision that suggested deep understanding of both aerodynamics and combat tactics. "How?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "How is any of that possible?" Emma retrieved her airplane and walked back toward the group, her expression showing neither triumph nor arrogance, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully communicated something important. "The paper airplane has different limitations than a real fighter jet," she explained patiently. "It can't generate thrust, so all maneuvering has to be based on converting potential energy to kinetic energy and managing that exchange efficiently. But it also has advantages. The weight-to-surface area ratio allows for maneuvers that would be impossible with heavier aircraft." Captain Williams stepped forward, her eyes bright with professional excitement. "Emma, that Cobra maneuver, how did you calculate the angle of attack necessary to maintain controlled flight through such an extreme nose-up attitude?" "I studied videos of the Russian demonstration teams," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "The Sukhoi fighters that perform the Cobra use thrust vectoring to maintain control. But paper planes don't have engines, so I had to find a different approach. The key is designing the center of gravity and center of pressure relationship so that the airplane naturally wants to recover from extreme attitudes." The technical discussion that followed drew in several of the base's pilots, who found themselves asking increasingly sophisticated questions about aerodynamics, control theory, and flight dynamics. Emma answered each query with the confidence and precision of someone who had studied these subjects extensively. Colonel Hayes moved closer to the group, her expression thoughtful as she listened to the 8-year-old girl discuss advanced aviation concepts with trained military pilots. As base commander, She had seen thousands of aviators at every stage of their careers, but she had never encountered someone so young who demonstrated such intuitive understanding of flight. "Miss Rodriguez," the colonel said, her voice carrying the authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. "I'm Colonel Hayes, the commander of this base. I've been watching your demonstration with great interest." Emma turned to face the base commander with the same respectful attention she had shown everyone else. But her eyes widened slightly as she recognized the colonel's rank and the significance of her interest in the situation. "Yes, ma'am," Emma replied, standing a little straighter. "Thank you for letting me demonstrate on your base. I think we need to have a longer conversation about your capabilities," Colonel Hayes said, glancing meaningfully at Major Hawkins, whose earlier confidence had been completely deflated by what he had witnessed. "But first, I'd like to ask Major Hawkins what he thinks about what he's seen today." All eyes turned to the Major, who found himself in the uncomfortable position of having his assumptions thoroughly demolished by a child. His face showed the internal struggle of someone trying to reconcile decades of professional experience with evidence that challenged everything he thought he knew. I'm not sure what to think," Hawkins admitted, his voice lacking any trace of his earlier arrogance. "What I just saw shouldn't be possible. A paper airplane can't perform maneuvers like that. But I watched it happen with my own eyes." Emma looked up at him with an expression that held no trace of smugness or satisfaction. Only the patient understanding of someone who had faced skepticism before and knew that changing minds took time. "Sir, would you like me to explain the engineering principles?" she asked gently. "I have drawings that show how the control surfaces work and calculations for the center of gravity modifications." Major Hawkins stared down at the girl who had just offered to teach him something about aviation, and for the first time in his military career, he found himself genuinely humbled by someone less than half his height and a quarter of his age. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think I would like that very much." What followed was an impromptu technical briefing that drew the attention of every pilot and engineer on the base. Emma spread her drawings on the hood of a nearby vehicle and began explaining the theoretical foundation of her paper airplane, designs with the clarity and precision of a graduate level. Engineering instructor. Her drawings revealed months of systematic experimentation, detailed calculations, and design iterations that incorporated lessons learned from both successful and failed prototypes. She had documented wind tunnel tests conducted with a hairdryer and a cardboard box, stability analyzers based on mathematical models she had derived from textbooks, and performance comparisons that tracked the effects of different modifications. "Key insight," Emma explained, pointing to a complex diagram that showed airflow patterns over her airplane's wing, "is that paper planes operate in a different flight regime than powered aircraft. They're essentially gliders with very specific design constraints. But within those constraints, you can achieve remarkable performance if you understand the physics involved." Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the base's chief aeronautical engineer, had joined the crowd and was studying Emma's drawings with professional fascination. "These calculations are correct," she said, her voice filled with amazement. "The mathematical models are sophisticated enough to be used in actual aircraft design." Emma beamed at the validation from a professional engineer, but her focus remained on sharing her knowledge rather than celebrating her achievement. "Dr. Martinez, would you like to see the stability derivatives I calculated for different wing configurations? I think they might be useful for understanding why some designs work better than others." The technical discussion continued for over an hour, with experienced military personnel asking questions that revealed their growing respect for the young girl's knowledge and insight. Emma answered every query with patience and precision, often illustrating her points with additional diagrams or quick demonstrations using spare sheets of paper. Meanwhile, Major Hawkins found himself in the unfamiliar position of being a student rather than a teacher. He listened intently as Emma explained concepts that challenged his understanding of flight dynamics, asked thoughtful questions about her methodology, and gradually began to appreciate the depth of knowledge that had seemed impossible in someone so young. "Emma," he said during a brief pause in the technical discussion, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong to dismiss your work without understanding what you had achieved. Your knowledge of aerodynamics is genuinely impressive, and your demonstrations have taught me things I didn't know were possible." Emma looked up at the Major with the same direct gaze that had characterized their entire interaction. But now, her expression held warmth, along with determination. "Thank you, sir. I understand why you were skeptical. Most people don't expect kids to know about advanced aviation concepts. But my dad always says that good ideas can come from anyone, regardless of age or rank." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been watching the proceedings with a mixture of pride and amazement, stepped forward to put a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Emma's been studying aviation since she was 5, he said. "She reads college-level textbooks for fun, watches every documentary about military aircraft she can find, and spends hours calculating optimal flight paths for her paper planes. This isn't just a hobby for her. It's a passion that drives everything she does." Colonel Hayes had been observing the interaction with the analytical mind that had made her one of the Air Force's most effective leaders. Now she addressed Emma directly, her voice carrying the weight of someone making an important decision. "Miss Rodriguez, what you've demonstrated today is extraordinary. Your understanding of flight dynamics, your technical knowledge, and your practical application of theoretical concepts suggest genuine potential for a career in aviation. Have you thought about what you want to do when you're older?" Emma's face lit up with the excitement of someone whose deepest dreams had just been acknowledged by authority she respected. "Yes, ma'am. I want to be a fighter pilot, just like Captain Williams. I want to fly the fastest, most advanced aircraft in the world, and maybe someday become a test pilot for experimental designs." "Those are ambitious goals," Colonel Hayes said, "but based on what I've seen today, they're not unrealistic. However, becoming a military pilot requires more than just understanding aerodynamics. It requires physical conditioning, mental discipline, leadership skills, and the ability to perform under extreme pressure." "I understand, ma'am. I've been preparing for that too. I run every morning with my dad. I study military history and tactics, and I practice making quick decisions under stress. Captain Williams has been helping me understand what it takes to be a real pilot." Captain Williams stepped forward, her expression mixing professional pride with personal affection for her young protege. "Colonel Emma has been working with me for several months, and I can confirm that her dedication goes far beyond just technical knowledge. She has the kind of analytical mind, attention to detail, and determination that characterize our best pilots. Obviously, she's years away from being old enough to begin actual flight training, but her foundation is remarkable." Colonel Hayes nodded thoughtfully, then turned to address the entire group that had gathered around Emma's impromptu technical briefing. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed today is a reminder that excellence can emerge from unexpected sources. This young lady has demonstrated not only technical knowledge, but also the kind of innovative thinking that drives advances in aviation technology. I think we can all learn something from her approach to problem solving, and her refusal to accept limitations without testing them." She faced Emma directly, her expression serious but encouraging. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm going to make you an offer. Our base has an educational outreach program that works with local schools to promote STEM education. I'd like to invite you to become our youngest consultant, helping us develop curricula that make aviation science accessible to other young people." Emma's eyes widened with excitement and disbelief. "You mean I could help teach other kids about flying?" "Exactly. Your ability to explain complex concepts in understandable terms, combined with your hands-on demonstrations, could inspire a new generation of aviators and engineers. Would you be interested in that kind of responsibility?" Yes, ma'am, I would love to help other kids understand how amazing aviation can be." Major Hawkins, who had been listening to the exchange with growing admiration for the girl who had so thoroughly challenged his assumptions, stepped forward with an expression of genuine respect. "Emma, I want to add something to the Colonel's offer. I'd like to personally sponsor your participation in our base's junior aviation program. That would include access to our flight simulators, technical libraries, and mentorship from our most experienced pilots. Consider it my way of apologizing for underestimating your capabilities." The crowd around them erupted in spontaneous applause as the significance of the moment became clear. Emma Rodriguez, the 8-year-old girl who had been dismissed as a child playing with paper toys, was being welcomed into the professional aviation community as a colleague and teacher. Emma looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing respect, admiration, and genuine excitement about her potential contributions to their field. For a moment, she seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice carrying the dignity that had characterized her throughout the entire confrontation. "Thank you for giving me a chance to show what I could do, and for believing that kids can contribute something valuable." Dr. Martinez approached with a technical question about one of Emma's wing design modifications, and soon the conversation returned to the detailed discussion of aerodynamics that had captivated the group of professionals. But now, the dynamic had changed completely. Instead of a child trying to prove herself to skeptical adults, Emma was participating as an equal in a community of experts who recognized her unique contributions. As the afternoon progressed, and families began to leave the base, Emma found herself surrounded by business cards from pilots, engineers, and educators who wanted to stay in touch with the remarkable young aviator they had discovered. Captain Williams helped her organize the contacts and explained how each person might contribute to her aviation education. "Emma," Captain Williams said, as they prepared to leave, "today, you didn't just demonstrate your knowledge of flight dynamics. You showed everyone here what's possible when intelligence, dedication, and courage come together. You're going to inspire a lot of people." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez watched his daughter interact with some of the most accomplished aviators on the base and felt a surge of pride that went beyond typical parental satisfaction. Emma hadn't just impressed a group of professionals, she had earned their respect and opened doors to opportunities that would shape her entire future. As they walked toward their car, Emma, carrying her precious paper airplane and a folder full of contact information, Major Hawkins caught up with them. "Emma, wait," he called, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the tarmac. "I wanted to give you something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of wings, the silver pilot's insignia that he had earned decades earlier during his own flight training. The wings showed the wear of years of service, but they gleamed with the pride of someone who had dedicated his life to aviation. "These are my first set of wings," he said, placing them carefully in Emma's hands. "I earned them when I was 22 years old, after months of the most challenging training I'd ever experienced. I want you to have them, not because you've earned them yet, but because I believe someday you will." Emma stared down at the wings with the reverence of someone who understood their significance. In the military aviation community, a pilot's wings represented not just technical skill, but dedication, sacrifice, and the acceptance of enormous responsibility. "Sir, I can't take these. They're yours. You earned them." "Yes, I did earn them," Major Hawkins replied, "but earning something means having the right to decide what to do with it, and I've decided that these wings belong with someone who has the potential to achieve things in aviation that I never imagined possible. Wear them as a reminder that the sky isn't the limit for someone with your capabilities." Emma carefully pinned the wings to her shirt, and for a moment, she looked less like an 8-year-old child and more like the future fighter pilot she dreamed of becoming. The wings seemed to transform her, connecting her to a lineage of aviators who had pushed the boundaries of what was possible in flight. "Thank you, Major Hawkins. I promise I'll work every day to become worthy of wearing them." "You're already worthy," he replied. "Today you taught me that excellence doesn't depend on age, rank, or experience. It depends on curiosity, dedication, and the courage to challenge assumptions, even when those assumptions are held by people who should know better." As the Rodriguez family drove away from Nellis Air Force Base that evening, Emma sat in the back seat, studying the wings that now adorned her shirt and reviewing the business cards from pilots and engineers who wanted to support her aviation education. The paper airplane that had started the day's events rested carefully in her lap. No longer just a child's toy, but a symbol of what was possible when knowledge, creativity, and determination came together. "Dad," she said, as they passed through the base gates, "do you think I really could become a fighter pilot someday?" Miguel Rodriguez looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror, seeing not just the child he had raised, but the remarkable young woman she was becoming. The day's events had shown him that Emma's dreams weren't just childhood fantasies. They were achievable goals supported by genuine talent and recognized by some of the most accomplished professionals in aviation. "Mia," he said, his voice filled with pride and certainty. "After what I saw today, I believe you can become anything you set your mind to. The sky isn't the limit for you. It's just the beginning." Emma smiled and returned her attention to the technical drawings she had shared with the base's pilots and engineers. Tomorrow, she would begin working on new designs that incorporated the feedback she had received from professional aviators. She would start preparing for the educational outreach program that would let her teach other children about the wonders of flight. And she would continue pursuing the dream that had driven her since she was old enough to look up at the sky and wonder what it would be like to soar among the clouds. But tonight, wearing the wings that represented acceptance into a community she had always longed to join, Emma Rodriguez was no longer just a little girl with paper airplanes and big dreams. She was a future aviator whose journey had officially begun. Supported by mentors who believed in her potential and inspired by the knowledge that the impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been achieved yet. The paper airplane rested in her lap, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the simplest tools and the most audacious dreams. And as the lights of Nellis Air Force Base faded behind them, Emma was already planning her next demonstration, her next design, and her next step toward the cockpit of a fighter jet where she belonged.